It stepped into the middle of the road, as if it had been waiting for us. I stopped the car, more amused than frightened, and thankful that it had appeared in the bright openness of the day than at night around some shadow-draped bend in the road. My wife said, "Ah," as if the thing were a puppy. Neither of us sensed anything off or unusual about the deer, and at that moment it appeared innocent enough, just a harmless animal who had wandered into the middle of the road, intrigued by the coasting metal behemoth. I lightly tapped the horn, hoping it would be startled enough to return to where it had come, or finish crossing, but it remained still, staring at us, its black, beady eyes glimmering in the sunlight. We'd been on our way to meet with a realtor about seeing a house in the area to rent for the summer, and had told her we'd arrive by noon. The car's clock read 10:43 a.m., and we still had about an hour to go. Not wanting to antagonize the creature, but also not wanting to be late to our appointment, I opened my car door and stepped out onto the road. The deer watched me, passively, almost as if it were bored. I waved my arms and shouted a little, hoping it'd be enough to scare the animal away. I knew that's what you're apparently supposed to do with bears, and I figured the general idea would work on any animal that didn't often interact with humans. But the deer stayed still. It was only when standing on the road that I realized how subtly weird it seemed. Not weird in any immediately recognizable sense, but more of an impression. An intimation born of the atmosphere surrounding it. The more I stared, the more I became certain that there was an oddness about it, even though it hadn't moved a muscle since stepping into the road. I turned to my wife, who gave me an amused glance. She hadn't picked up on anything off about the animal. I gestured for her to get out of the car and stand by me, and she did so. Together we stared at the deer, who met our gaze nonchalantly, as if it had come to know everything about us and cared very little about the information. My wife asked if there was something wrong with it, and I heard a faint tinge of worry in her voice. Glancing at her, I saw that she too had been given the same eerie impression, and so I motioned for her to get back in the car. I followed. The deer made no move towards us. I planned on slowly driving around it, hoping that it wouldn't move one way or the other and collide with us. With glacial slowness, I turned to the right, and for the first few moments the deer simply stood there, languidly following the car's path with its head. But upon coming alongside it, it did something quite incredible, and something extremely unsettling. The deer stood on its hind legs and stomped in front of the car. I slammed on the brakes, needlessly, considering the turtleish speed I'd been going, and swore loudly. My wife let out a similar exclamation and reeled back in her seat. The deer, still standing on two legs, then brought its forelegs up and placed its hooves against its antlers, as if to steady its head. Whilst making eye contact with me, it broke off a portion of the antler and slanted into the hood of my car like a spike. The vehicle bounced with the impact, as if a heavy stone had been dropped on it. I was obviously caught off guard by the display of self-mutilation and the subsequent violence against us, but what frightened me even more was the dexterity with which the deer had committed the act. It had moved like something else, something that only wore the appearance of a deer but possessed the demeanor and mannerisms of a wholly different creature. The deer stood back and relaxed its posture, as if its attack had been some declaration I was meant to understand. My mind grappled for answers. I knew that deer shed their antlers, and that they could sometimes suffer from some sort of animal mania, a deterioration of body and mind. I wanted to apply these two events to the deer before us, thinking that, in doing so, I had somehow lessened the terror that crept steadily through my veins. But I knew, somehow, that neither phenomenon explained this deer's behavior. Its movements, though violent, had been careful, deft, committed with intelligence. Not the clumsy flailing and mundanely wild behavior indicative of neurological collapse. I put the car into reverse and backed away, while the fractured piece of antler wobbled in the car's hood. The deer, apparently not finished with us, began running and then sprinting after the car, still on 2 legs. Stricken with a dumb panic, I didn't think to turn around and drive normally, and neither did my wife think to make such a suggestion. With preternatural speed, given its bipedal locomotion, the deer gained on us. Just as it had done before, it broke off a section of its antler and, without stopping, launched it like a small spear at the car. The antler fragment pierced the windshield and impaled me in the shoulder. My last sensible brain cell impelled me to stop the car, lest I run us off the road or hit something in my agonized senselessness. My wife continued to scream, but not just at the fragment of bone embedded in my shoulder. The deer, now looking even more unsettling with its asymmetrical and fractured arrangement of antlers, was walking towards us with an unmistakably malicious gait, the confident saunter of a murderer whose prey had fallen into one of his traps. I tried to lean forward, but the simple exertion elicited more pain in that short moment than I'd ever experienced in my life. My wife kept calling my name and pointing at the deer, who was only a few meters away. Seeing only death in its pitch-black eyes, I knew that if I told her to get out and run, it'd be on her in only a few minutes. I was also fairly certain that a vehicle wouldn't provide any worthwhile protection against it. It radiated deep inner power, an ultra-bestial might. The deer's baleful glare assured me that attempting to drive away would be futile. It would catch us sooner than later. My lizard brain kicked in, overpowering my more developed senses and thought processes. I had to at the very least save my wife. I'd die to protect her, if necessary. Squinting, but not closing my eyes, and gripping the steering wheel as tightly as possible, I leaned forward and eventually dislodged the point of the antler from the seat behind me. For a moment the pain was horribly immense, a searing, pressure-building awfulness that made my head pound and quickened my heartbeat alarmingly. But then it became this almost abstract, secondary thing, heightening to an intensity my mind couldn't, or chose not to, process in the moment. I heard my wife's hysterical voice to my left, but the words might as well have been in another language. My mind could only focus on keeping me conscious. Trembling, I got out of the car and told my wife to drive away. She shouted something incompressible, screamed at me pleadingly, but I ignored her and marched toward the deer. Without looking back, I again called out for her to drive away, to go find help, not actually believing I survived long enough to receive it. The deer eyed me with only a passing interest, as if it were mildly surprised that I had managed to pry the antler from the seat. I hadn't removed it from my shoulder, leaving it sheathed in the pulsing, bleeding flesh, knowing I'd probably pass out if I even so much as touched it. The deer stopped its approach only a few feet ahead of me. On its hind legs it towered over me, standing at around 8 feet tall. There was a plainly evil aura about it, as if it were demon-possessed. The corded thews of its limbs pulsed and flexed in rhythm with its broad chest, on which its thick hide bristled wildly. There was an expectantly animal scent about it, but also some other smell, an emission my mind couldn't rightly comprehend. An image of wild forests teeming with life, overgrown, fearsome, and primordial, flashed into my mind for the briefest of moments before evaporating into mental oblivion. I felt as if I stood before a beast of time-forgotten antiquity, who come to toss a stone at the modern order of things. I prepared myself for some horrible transformation, some unprecedented and unthinkable development in this creature's unquestioningly malefic existence. Still, I swore to myself that I would fight for as long as possible, dealing whatever blows I could before the thing could end me. Instead, it slowly, almost theatrically raised its arm, pointing its hoof at something behind me. Risking a sucker punch, I turned back and saw my wife still sitting in the passenger seat, eyes wide with incredulity and terror. Again, I waved for her to drive away, but she only shook her head, tears spraying every which way. Then the sound of 1,000 hoofbeats broke through the otherwise peaceful silence. From both sides of the road, seeming to manifest out of the very air, came hordes of deer. Dozens, hundreds of them, stampeding endlessly from the furthest spans of my vision. Wave after ordered and undulant wave of Cervine. Under normal seconds, it would have been incredible, bewildering. But under those, it was horrifying, nightmarish, something I wouldn't have anticipated in my darkest predictions of that already grim situation. What caused my spirit to plummet almost irretrievably was the course of the deer. Upon nearing the road, they turned, veering towards the car, towards my wife. I screamed at her to leave, forgetting, for the moment, the bipedal herald of the deer standing only a few feet away. Finally, thankfully, her own animal instincts compelled her to forget about me and save herself. She scrambled to the driver's seat, started the car, and peeled away. The horde of deer followed, galloping intently after her, and bleating with an appalling communal excitement. But despite their numbers and tenacity, the speeding vehicle steadily pulled away. They apparently lacked the preternatural ability of the creature that had summoned them. After only a few moments, I was left alone with the evil deer. I silently prayed that no new horrors would manifest, and that my wife would successfully escape the pursuing deer and reach safety. Turning back to my opponent, I saw that it had lowered its arm and was standing expectantly, awaiting my challenge. There was no smile on its face. I'm not even sure if deer can smile, but it was obvious that it looked forward to fighting, and most likely killing me. Spiked by my terror, adrenaline surged through me. Almost absent-mindedly, I withdrew the antler piece from my shoulder. Pain flared for a moment, but was summarily dismissed. Now armed with a weapon, though an admittedly meager one, I stood boldly before the beast. "Come now, human. Prove to me you deserve your station in this kingdom." I chuckled darkly at this latest absurdity. Of course the thing could talk. I took one last look at the sunlit stretch of land around me, and then, with everything I could muster, raised the repurposed dagger and lunged at my foe. I'm told that I was found on the road, covered in blood, not all of it my own. There were scraps of tattered deer hide throughout the area, but no deer carcass was found. There were hoof prints on my chest and stomach, and many of my ribs were broken. Horrible bruises marked my face, and I bled from several lacerations throughout my body. EMTs had needed to break my thumb to remove the antler fragment I'd been clutching with a death grip. After that, I was airlifted to the nearest hospital, where I underwent several surgeries. According to my wife, the deer had abruptly ceased their pursuit of her when she entered the bounds of the nearest town, and there had been no sight of them since. Our realtor was contacted, and the situation was explained to her. Strangely, again, according to my wife, her surprise had sounded disingenuous, almost as if she'd anticipated the news. Someone at the hospital had also remarked to my wife that the animals, not just the deer, seemed almost consciously protective of the area near the house, as if the land was sacred. They'd said this in passing, with no real thought to conceptualize something so bizarre as a planned attack on us by the animals. I'll probably be spending a good portion of my summer recovering. For next year, we've decided to look elsewhere for a summer home.